Hi everyone, I'm Gary, and today we're going to talk about something a little bit different, a little bit exciting, something that I'm really kind of jazzed to talk about. And what we're going to talk about is Mordheim. Now, I've already talked about my love of Mordheim on this channel. Games Workshop's fantasy skirmish game, first released in 1999, set in Warhammer's Old World. You can see my kind of discussion of the aesthetics and my generalized kind of like love of that game here if you just click up. But recently, the Warhammer fantasy scene has been dominated by this game, Warhammer: The Old World, which is Games Workshop's kind of soft reboot of Warhammer Fantasy. So, of course, it's going to kind of dominate that kind of particular niche right now. Now, I want to say that when The Old World was announced, I was kind of immediately suckered in. But even that suggests I had too much power in it. As soon as that game got mentioned, as soon as it was launched, especially earlier this year, I've been kind of sweating known oil about getting going with an Empire army. So, with that in mind, me and a few friends, some of us veterans of Warhammer Fantasy, some of us complete novices to both the setting and the game, decided that we're going to build our models up and we were going to kind of play some games of the old world. Now, as we built those kind of old world armies up, what we would do is we would use those models to play smaller skirmish games. Specifically, we'd use those models that we're going to use in the old world for playing Mordheim. And therefore, this video is me talking through that process, choosing some models, going about how I would use them, and then why I chose them in regards to how I'm going to use them in my Empire army for the old world, and why I've also been using them as a Witch Hunter Warband for Mordheim. So let's get going. Now, first of all, my first consideration when choosing a faction was they had to be compatible with my old world army. There was no point in building something that I wasn't going to be able to use later on. Despite what it might seem on this channel, I don't have all that much time for hobbying. My professional life is quite demanding. And what it means is that I have to really carefully think about how to spend my time. Because otherwise I'll end up producing things or doing things or painting models or playing games or writing games or running games that ultimately are going to be kind of very much for themselves and actually not a good use of my time in terms of usability in other situations. So when I was choosing a faction, I know I'm going to play an Empire army in the old world. So I started looking through the Mordheim rulebook because there's plenty of factions in here. There's the Sisters of Sigmar, there's Skaven, there's the Cult of the Possessed. But there's also a couple of factions that I could almost certainly use in my Empire army. There's a whole slew of mercenaries, the Reichlanders, Marienburgers, there is Middenheimers, but what I decided was I would go for a Witch Hunter faction. Now, I hadn't entirely decided this and decided to look at a couple of different websites. There's some really cool websites for people looking for Mordheim resources. The game has been out of print for nearly 20, well, it's been out of print, I think, for over 20 years now. And there's two websites that I'd like to give a real shout out to. That is Broheim and the Mordheimer. Both of these are enormously useful fan sites that have dozens of extra rules, resources like reference cards, extra factions, both official and unofficial, and they're contributed to quite actively by members of the Mordheim community, which itself is still kind of very much alive. So I looked through those, and then I ultimately decided, yeah, I was going to do a Witch Hunter faction. Why? Well, I thought I could use the Witch Hunter characters and the Warrior Priest characters in the Warband in my old world army as is, and then all the Zealots, which are the kind of ragtag mercenaries that form a Witch Hunter's Warband. I could use those as a free company militia unit in my old world army. So, okay, there's a lot of crosstalk here. And, you know, I decided Witch Hunters instead of the generic mercenary factions. My Empire army is going to be a Reichland army. So why didn't I choose the Reichland mercenaries? Well, I love Witch Hunters. That's the reason I love that archetype, right? The dual like flintlock pistols, the kind of like the rapier, the big capote hats. I just, oh man, that stuff is exactly the sort of fantasy I love. I love Solomon Kane, Robert E. Howard's witch hunting character. I've talked about my love of Robert E. Howard's Pulp Fiction before, especially his Conan stories. You can see that my GM required reading list up here. And I also love the Witch Hunter trilogy for War, specifically written in Warhammer setting by C.L. Werner, which follows Matthias Thulman, which is a sort of homage to Witchfinder General, the kind of classic of British horror films. I'd recommend those novels. So I really like Witch Hunters, and I decided to go for that. Now, how did I go about choosing these models? Now, What I thought I'd do first is I wanted this to be a little bit of a kind of experimental archaeology lesson at first, where I was like, okay, I'll look at what was in the original Mordheim box set for when Mordheim was actually in print. What if you bought a Mordheim, if you bought a Witch Hunter faction then, what did you get in the box? Now, if you look at these boxes on eBay, they are eye-wateringly expensive. You can get an original kind of like starter set for Mordheim. It's going to run you over 100 quid easily. Now, that's not what I'm interested in. I just wanted to see a picture of the back of the box to work out what was in them. And actually, it was kind of quite reassuring because there was a couple of witch hunters that you got, and I think maybe 4 or 5 effectively zealots, like hired goons that are going to be really helpful. And I thought, okay, that's not too many models. I can definitely do this. I can throw myself into this and really get something that I'm going to enjoy doing. So where did I get the models from in the end? Now, I own a 3D printer. I own a little kind of Elegoo Mars, and I'm a really big believer in 3D printing for games that are out of print. I don't think they're that helpful for printing huge mass combat armies. No matter what anyone says, I think they're intensely useful in certain situations. And I'm a big believer in 3D printing. I own 2 3D printers. I own an FDM and a little resin printer, and I use them for printing models and characters all the time for my role-playing games. So obviously, I need to choose some STLs, the files that I use on 3D printers for what I was going to use for my Witch Hunters. And I found a couple of different sellers on my mini factory that I thought, oh, okay, these are going to work. So the first one was Victis Miniatures. Now, it's quite obvious to me that Victis, not all their models, not even the majority of them, but at least some of the models that Victis do are intended to be used in Mordheim Warbands. They're intended to fill that gap because Games Workshop no longer support that game. So I bought their modular kit of kind of like guys that are going to be like soldiers that I could use as my zealots. And then for the witch hunters themselves, I wanted a male and a female one, and I found Monstrous Encounters. Now, Monstrous Encounters do fantastic, interesting, old school, middle school kind of Warhammer models. The kind of aesthetic that would have been common in Warhammer in the 1990s. Big heroic scale, kind of like Witch Hunter. Thought, oh, this is really, really cool. Got one from the male Witch Hunter. And then for my female Witch Hunter, I got one from Tiger Miniatures. I don't know how you pronounce that. Taiga. Tiaga, maybe? Tiaga Miniatures. Really cool model. Got that. And then what I decided to do was that I would build them in Lightsheet Slicer, build them electronically. I'm not going to be like Blender or anything. I'm not a kind of 3D modeler. But I thought I'm basically quite a lazy person, and that I will print them as close to being ready as possible. So I put them on the bases in kind of like, digitally put them on the bases. And then I also digitally assembled the zealots. Now, Victis actually do pre-assembled models from these kits, and they look a bit more dynamic than the ones I came up with because I assembled them myself. They're a little bit kind of like static, like. But I actually don't mind that too much for 2 reasons. One, because they're a kind of endless rabble, so I'm not going to spend too much time looking at them individually once the game gets going. And secondly, especially a game of Old World once they're Free Company Militia. And secondly, that's what Mordheim models actually looked like back in the day. They were pretty static and non-dynamic models. They were like, they have like swords out here, or like, they just don't look very dynamic at all anyway. So I thought, okay, this actually to some extent captures that Middlehammer aesthetic, the modeling aesthetic, better than I originally intended, despite my own chronic laziness. Now, I printed them. I had to stir up the resin a bit. Anyone who knows resin printing knows that if you leave the resin out for any amount of time, it kind of separates. So I had to give it a good stir, and then I let them print. Now, I got a misprint on one of the zealots first because as I said, I put them on the bases out of laziness already because I don't have to glue them on bases, and I hadn't supported it properly, so it warped. So I had to reprint that one. But after a couple of hours and putting them in IPA, and cleaning them and then putting them in the curing station. I have an LQ Mercury Plus curing station, so that came out fine. I was like, I'm pretty happy. Now, the one thing that I wasn't happy about these models was that the female witch hunter, man, she was fragile. Yeah, like lots of really thin parts. One thing that I find frustrating about 3D printing is that sometimes when things are digitally sculpted, really not much thought is given to the fact that these things are going to be printed in very brittle resin. And any kind of really tiny part's going to break off. As I got the models out to actually show you for this video, I brought the sword off the female witch hunter. and had to kind of then take the pommel off and repaint it so she just has a kind of bald fist. But that's okay, it's no problem. But it is one of those considerations when 3D printing. Then, what I decided to do after that is that I based them. So they're already on the bases, as I said. I printed them on the bases, but I needed to texture the bases. If the basing was something artificial, like the inside of a spacecraft, you know, that kind of like metallic gangway material, or if it was going to be like cobblestones, I would have probably included that as part of the base when I printed them. But if it's something natural, like soil, open countryside, field, rough pasture, any of that kind of stuff, I always think it's better to glue that on afterwards. I think it looks more realistic and also just looks less sort of stilted and kind of, it looks a bit soft otherwise. It just doesn't look right if it's 3D printed. I don't think anyway. So I went through each of the models and I based them individually. All I did was use an old brush and brush some PVA on there and then dip them in an aggregate of different size, a bit of sand, a bit of kind of like different sized stones and pebbles. And they came out looking really, really good. Now, I should have really watered down the PVA. There's a wonderful book on applying basing aggregates, well, not just on that, on building terrain by Mel Bose, the terrain tutor. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. His book Terrain Essentials talks about when applying any aggregates, you really need to water it down so that the PVA soaks into the aggregate a bit better. But I'm doing this on such a small scale that I just, I'm not doing terrain, so I thought it just doesn't matter. I'm just going to put the pure PVA on there and then leave them to dry. And they looked absolutely fantastic. I was really happy with how they turned out. Now, I was really excited to get these models to the table. The last time I played Mordheim was 2016, and I played Witch Hunters then, but back then, 3D printing wasn't really an option. It might have been for some people if you had loads of money, but it wasn't for me. And I don't think the quality of 3D prints was that good, kind of like nearly, 8 years ago now. I was poor and I was just post-uni back then. I was only a couple of years out of uni, still trying to find my way. So my Witch Hunter warband that I had then, because I did actually have a Witch Hunter warband, was a bit stilted. It was just a couple of Empire State Troopers, just ordinary swordsmen, and then I had some cheap D&D kind of witch finders from one of those kind of like, they used to do those models and kind of like they were kind of like in a rubber soft plastic kind of thing, and it was a bit rubbish, but I still really enjoyed it. And this is me going back and doing it the way I always wanted to do it. Now, what I love then, and is still what I love now, is that I just love Mordheim. I love the fact that the game allows emergent narrative. I like the fact that the characters and the groups of henchmen, they gain skills, that they can go exploring between games and find all sorts of strange and wondrous things in the City of the Damned. And if you're using some of these expansions, they can find things in the countryside as well. So I waited for them to dry, the basing to dry, and then I decided to prime them. Now, the key thing here is that I decided to prime them with an airbrush. Let's get this straight. Before this video, decided to do this video, I didn't own an airbrush. I never used an airbrush, never decided to use an airbrush, and I watched a couple of videos, and I bought what I think is a reasonably good airbrush, an Iowata Eclipse, and I'm desperate to not ruin it, right, because I'm pretty clumsy with stuff. So what I did was I bought this and a small compressor, and before this, I'd always primed with a spray can. Now, I'm effectively going to slap chop these, right? I'm going to put a varying different undertones on and then some kind of like high pigmentation, high flow paints onto them that way. And what I decided to do was I watched a really cool video by Ninjon where he talks about priming with an airbrush. He's not really about with an airbrush, it's just priming for slap chop. And I thought, okay, I'm going to use that as my kind of like go-to for how I'm going to do this. So this is what I did. I started with black and I spread them all over with black. Now, interestingly, it didn't go on as well as I thought it would. It didn't go on as well as, in my experience, a spray can would. So I did a second coat and covered all the recesses and it was fine. Now, I wanted to remove the absolute darkness of the black. So I sprayed the models with a deep purple from below to hopefully add a kind of purpley depth to the shadows as I move on to using kind of contrast paints. I thought purple instead of a kind of midnight blue, which is what would be traditionally used for this, because I thought a kind of a magic purple, a kind of deep midnight purple almost, would be really useful in terms of, well, I think it's a very bruised color. It's very kind of like bodily in that sense. It's a good undertone for skin, but also I think it kind of, that bruised kind of atmosphere is best embodied by Mordheim, which is this kind of like nightmare Blanchian hellscape of the city. And then what I decided to do is from the top, I use Mornfang Brown, which is a kind of quite warm, dark brown. And this, again, it was just to move away from everything being that kind of really dark black. And then what I did the classic slap top. I sprayed straight down with white, pure white. But this left it looking really flat, and I thought, oh, I've kind of washed out a lot of these undertones that I've already done, and there's not going to be any point in me doing this if I just go with this. So what I did was I went back and I did the same process again, straight down, but focusing on hitting a zenithal and the larger exposed areas, especially on the front, like the chest, and maybe on the back where there's a big flying rub, with a warm sun yellow. And again, this worked really well with the Mordheim brown for just adding those transitions in before I'd even picked up the brush, before I'd even picked up a physical brush and started painting. And then what I did was I went back to the white. I added a little bit of that, I think it's Avalon Sunset, that kind of like warm yellow. And I just hit the kind of the face, the very top, and then the chest. And all that does is give me a nice transition of the colors. I repeated this on all the miniatures, and I'm really proud of this. I'm proud of my first attempt at airbrushing. I'm not lying to you. It is the first thing I've ever airbrushed. I airbrushed a little piece of terrain to kind of get used to it, and then I thought, I'm just going to get going with this, because that is what I enjoy about this hobby the most, is trying new things, right? Tabletop gaming, we get to be improvisational theatres, storytellers, we get to be painters, artists, we get to draw, we get to do all these different things. I thought airbrushing is another one of those skills now that I'm hoping to add to my toolkit. Now, let's talk about the actual painting process now I've primed them. What am I trying to achieve here? What I'm trying to achieve is cool looking models that can eventually be used in a mass combat game. And this is really important because I think there's kind of 3 tiers of models and miniatures that are used in games that determine the amount of time you should spend prepping them for the table. First of all, character models. You're going to spend loads of time on a character model. Why? Because you can spend, for a role-playing game, that is, because you're going to spend loads of time looking at it. You're going to spend hours looking at it, and your friends are going to spend hours looking at it. I've talked about painting, specifically painting character models here. You can see my video on that. But the second category is models in war games, mass ranks of things. You're going to spend a long time looking at these as well. You're going to spend hours looking at these, your infantry for Warhammer 40k, for example. You're going to spend hours and hours and hours looking at those Primaris Marines. But they're part of mass ranked units, and therefore small mistakes or lack of, not putting 10 hours into a model, it's going to be okay. Because actually, there's so many of them that they kind of blend into one, and and this is very true, they're greater than the sum of their parts. So that's category 2. And the group that you're going to spend the least amount of time on, and you're going to use the least amount of techniques, they will be models monsters in role-playing games. Your orcs and your ogres, because they're going to be on the table like 20 minutes, and then the characters are going to kill them, and then they might not come out again for like maybe another year, maybe longer, maybe another 5 years, right? So there's no point spending too long on something that they're not got, just going to be killed. So those 3 categories. Now, because it's a warband, it's a warband for a skirmish game, so it's a mass combat game. So it's going to be that second category. Because it's not like huge amounts of models, it's only going to ever be about a dozen. I'm going to spend a little bit more time than I probably would on my Empire State Troopers. So I start by laying down the core colors, the browns and the tans, which are used to pick out the clothing, the belts, the buckles, and all of those sorts of things. Now, I wanted to use some off-whites and reds to give my zealots that kind of right-clan heraldry and livery, sorry, I should say, to help emphasize their imperial heritage. And I'm doing all of this with a variety of contrast paints from Games Workshop and speed paints from the Army Painter, which do exactly the same thing. Now, the Witch Hunters have these really awesome long flowing riding cloaks that I wanted to do a deep brown. And after layering down all those base colors, I come back and do the metals. Now, I'm going to do this with a kind of gunmetal, and these are done with traditional acrylics rather than contrast, because I think it gives a better look. Now, Army Painter do kind of high pigmentation, high flow, these kind of like speed paints, variety of paints for metallics, but I just don't like how they look. I don't think they work very well, despite the fact that the rest of the line works awesomely. So I did these in traditional acrylics, and they come out really, really nicely. And I use a couple of different metal colors, some bronzes, some golds, and some kind of like silver for the swords. Now, what I did then was I washed the whole models. And I washed all of them using Army Painter Strong Tone, which is a very dark brown wash. And I hit everywhere on the model, and making sure to try not get tide lines, making sure to try not to kind of like, just wash it all into the recesses. And I didn't want to hit the metallic parts with this, because I think a deep brown doesn't really work for metal. Instead, when I came to wash the metal, which I did secondly, I used Nuln Oil, which is a black wash. And what I liked about this is that when you use a black wash on metal, it makes it look really smoky, like pig iron, like, and it makes it, I just think it ages it really, really, really nicely. So that's how I did that. And then the cloaks of the witch hunters have this kind of, because it's such a large area, I wanted to build up some more color depth. So I added a layered dry brush of leather brown from Army Painter. The reason I used leather brown as the kind of color of accumulated dirt is because that is going to be the color of the bases. And then I went back over, it's the only time I use a dry brush to do this. I went back over with a kind of bone white just to really pick out the details. After the washing process, all the colors homogenize, and they always do. They homogenize almost too much in some places. So I go back and edge highlight. Now, edge highlighting is the process of, for those of you that, not into miniature painting, is painting the edges in the raised area with a slightly lighter color, increasing lighter colors in order to pick out those details and kind of make them pop, make them readable at a distance. I do this more on the witch hunters than the zealots and the dogs. And I do that because they are close to my character models. This is an example of one of those techniques that I'm going to save and do more on the things that require more time. I'm not going to do it on everything because, again, my time has value, as does yours, and you should be trying to use the maximum kind of number of techniques that are going to give you the best possible outcome, not every technique on every model every time, because no one has time for that. Then, at the very end, I based them all in the style of my old world army. Now, if this was a warband that was just going to be used for Mordheim, I'd have 3D printed them onto cobblestone bases. But I don't have time for that, and because these models have to be used for multiple purposes. These witch hunters are probably going to be used for Warhammer Quest as well. I've talked about my love of Warhammer Quest, best game Games Workshop's ever made. You can see my kind of very enthusiastic endorsement of it up here. I painted these bases leather brown, as I did on the cloak, and then a nice bone dry brush, followed by a little bit of static grass, which is just going to make them look really kind of like nice with all my other models in my old world army. I'm really happy with how they turned out. Now, thank you for taking the time to listen to me. I absolutely loved putting these models together, and I can't wait to get them to the table. My first game is against a kind of band of dwarf treasure hunters, so I'm wondering maybe the dogs will be helpful in kind of overrunning the enemy quickly, because dwarves don't move very quickly, but I'm worried about their propensity to use ranged black powder weapons. We'll see how it goes. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit like and subscribe, do all that good stuff, like I always say. But also, one thing I'd appreciate is if you'd let me know if you want to see me do maybe a battle report or two of Mordheim, because it's not the kind of content I usually do, but I'd love to record a game and talk about it, or maybe a couple. As ever, thanks for listening. I'm Gary, and I'll speak with you again soon.